Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're located in the country. I have the distinct pleasure this evening of introducing our webinar. I am Janice Howman. I am the chair of the National Consortium of Clinical Educators, which is a component of the Academic Council of, or the American Council of Academic Physical Therapy. I think we call it ACAPT too frequently for me to remember the name, the full name. And we're real excited to have you all join us here this evening. I know that we'll have continued participants coming in. We're expecting a large crowd this evening, and we're very excited about everyone's interest in our topic tonight. Catherine is going to run our slideshow for us this evening, so I'll have her go ahead and move to the first slide, and we'll kind of get started with introducing our co-sponsors for this course. The National Consortium of Clinical Educators and the Clinical Education Special Interest Group are very proud sponsors of this webinar this evening. We were very excited a couple of months ago when the authors of the Collaborative Model Toolkit approached the NCCE and the CE-SIG and shared with us their toolkit they had been developing so that they could pass this information along to our clinical educators, both academic and clinical, in both environments. And so this really fit along very well with what both the CE-SIG and NCCE were hoping to continue to do, and that is share resources among our clinical education community. And so on this first slide, you can see some of the resources that are available to clinical educators through the ACAPT NCCE website. And we also want to make sure that you recognize, if you did not receive it already, the toolkit itself for this webinar should have been sent to you, a link in the email about this webinar. If you didn't get it, we also made it available on both the CE-SIG and NCCE websites, and that is in the group chat. So if you click on the bottom of the screen and see the chat box, you will see both of the links that will take you to the document, the toolkit that we'll be talking about this evening. So if anyone has any questions or issues with that, please make sure that you use the chat. We will have someone monitoring that. Oh, I see someone has said that they don't see the links.
I think we have to repost them again. It's the whole thing. It doesn't show what was up prior to them entering the room.
Ah, okay.
Right?
Well, let's
forget about that.
Yep.
So Sherry, if you could copy and paste those maybe 15 minutes in when we're sure we've got everybody in the room.
That would be great. Oh, there it's coming up. So great. So we'll get those out so that everyone will be able to get that if they don't have that coming in to the session. For the NCCE, we have additional resources for clinical educators. You can see that we have a COVID response page, and as part of that, we have a document on the guidance for participation in clinical education, returning to the classroom and labs in regards to telehealth, all given this new COVID world that we're living in. We recognize the strain that COVID has put on clinical education, and we're hoping that some of these resources will help our clinical educators navigate this. In addition, the NCCE also has an open forum, a discussion board, and this, you don't have to be a member of ACAPT or of APTA to participate in this. If you follow the link that is shown on this page here, you will be able to register. And then once you register, you will have access to it whether you're a member or not of ACAPT or APTA. So all of those resources are available to you, and we will be posting this, the PowerPoint for this session too after the course. So you will have access to that when we get this all completed. But welcome and thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Carol to talk a little bit about the CE-SIG.
All right, thanks Janice. So I am Carol Beckel. I'm the academic co-chair of the Clinical Education SIG, which is a consortium or special interest group within the APTA Academy of Education. If you're keeping score, that's about our third name in 3 years, but we're done. This is it. So we are now the Academy of Education. We do also have resources up. We'll have these resources, and you will see links down there. We do have overlap between the NCCE and CSIG, but we've tried to commit to, let's just make sure the information is out there. We've been very happy to collaborate with NCCE on their leadership of the COVID document and pulling resources together. So we continue to try to be good resources for each other, and more importantly, good resources for our clinical faculty and our academic faculty as well too. So I have one point of housekeeping, and then we're going to turn it over to Catherine to get this started. As you're coming in, my name always comes up weird on these pages. If your name is just iPhone, at about an hour or so in, we're going to go into breakout rooms. So it would be helpful if we would at least know what your first name is so that we can really have a good conversation with each other. So if you go up to the right-hand corner of your picture, you'll see 3 dots. And if you click on that, you'll have the option of renaming yourself. So if you've always wanted to be Margaret and your name is Betty, you can be Margaret tonight. That's totally fine. But it would be helpful for us as a group or room leaders to be able to talk with everybody on a little more personal level. So with that, I turn this over to Catherine and all of our great presenters. And again, thank you for agreeing a second round on this. When they volunteered, I don't know if they knew what they bit off with Janice and I, but we're thrilled to have this opportunity again.
Thank you to Janice and Carol for all of the background work, for allowing us to bring this material to everybody so that you have some support and some tools and some ideas for how to incorporate collaborative clinical education right now. I also want to say thanks to Sherry and Jamil who are on this webinar. They have been absolutely instrumental in the whole setup and registration process, and there's no way that our team could have done this without them. So thank you very much to both of you. I will introduce our speakers. So I am Catherine Bilyeu. I'm from the University of Colorado, and I came into this project a little bit after it got started. It was the brainchild of Katie Myers and Alice Davis. Katie is now at Duke University. She was at University of Colorado at the time that this project started. And so that's how Katie and I are connected. She has moved on to Duke University and continued on with this line of work and supporting this model of clinical education. And then Alice Davis and Shalene Thomas are both at Regis University. And I work very closely with them. I'm lucky to say our 2 institutions are very collaborative in our approach to clinical education. So that's our team, and those will be the speakers for this evening. We mentioned early on that you'll want to have the toolkit available to have it as a reference as we're going through. The link is in the chat, or it was also emailed to you with the registration information. I'm going to run through just a couple of little housekeeping things that can help us with this large group presentation. If everybody can try their best to stay muted during the large group conversations, that will help us. And if anybody's having trouble with bandwidth, make sure you turn your camera off. And then we can turn cameras back on when we get into the small groups to really dive into some conversations around how to make this successful for your program or for your site. We will use the chat function to manage questions. We will have somebody managing the chat at all times. So please feel free to put relevant questions into the chat, and we will either answer them via the chat, or we will hold if we know that that topic is coming up and that we're gonna go over it shortly. So those are sort of the housekeeping things. So we're gonna start with a little poll here that you will see pop up shortly on your screen. And if you could answer it with what your primary role is, this just helps us get an idea of who is with us tonight. All right. So this is great. We've got a great blend, and this is really what we hoped to see, that we'd have a lot of clinical instructors here, both within physical therapy and physical therapy assistants. Got a good number of SCCEs and a good amount of academic representation. So this should create some good conversation when we break out into the smaller rooms. So that looks great to me. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so our objectives for this session are laid out here for you. We really hope you walk away with a good understanding of what the solid education principles are behind a 2-to-1 or collaborative model of education. We'll give a brief overview. We'll touch at times on the fairly significant amount of evidence that's out there to support the efficacy of this model. We really want you to walk away with some specific strategies and feeling like you could implement this even in these crazy times right now. And we will highlight the importance of the partnership between academic programs and clinical sites. This really doesn't work well unless you've got that partnership piece there. So before we dive into the details, we're going to do one more little poll here to get a feel of the room here and a feel of the mood. So Sherry, if you could swap the polls out for us. So think about first thoughts. What comes to mind? And any of these answers are fine. Okay, great. So a lot of tell me more, which is why you're here. And I think this whole spread of emotions around clinical education in general right now are to be expected. And we hope you walk away with shifting down towards E in terms of, I feel like I've got the tools that I need to embark on this new journey with collaborative education. All right, thank you, Sherry. We can stop sharing that. Okay, this first slide just orients you to the contents of the toolkit. The intention for today's session is not to go through the toolkit line by line. The intention is to highlight specific sections of the toolkit and specific ideas that we really think are critical for getting you started and getting you thinking about how, from the academic program side, do you promote and support this model, and how at the site level do you really feel like you're prepared and ready to teach effectively in this model. So those are the sections of the toolkit outlined there. So just briefly, this 2-to-1 education in physical therapy has been around for a long time in our profession. I have to always tell this story when we do this now. Katie, when she moved to Duke University, in cleaning out and getting settled in her new office, found a document from the National Clinical Education Conference in 2001, where they were really trying to promote this model, and there was information, written information that came out. So we all had a good chuckle that, this is out there. Why is nobody doing this? So we'll compare the two models of what we consider more traditional clinical education, which is that 1-to-1, 1 CI to 1 student model. The known benefits are that strong CI student relationship, and the students really perceive, when they are thinking about clinical education, they perceive that that model is going to be better for them. But there are barriers to this model that are also well documented in the literature. And most current literature that has come out really show that there is no one gold standard in clinical education delivery models. So why not look more in detail at some of these alternative models that have some interesting benefits? So in a collaborative clinical education model, When we dove into the literature as a team, there were numerous benefits that came to the surface fairly quickly in reviewing the literature that are listed here. Not the least of which is that there are significant or profound learning benefits for students. There are barriers, and a lot of the barriers surround the CI's perceived barriers. They're not known barriers, they're not proven, but there are a lot of perceptions around this just isn't going to work. So if we look at the literature, what CIs say about collaborative clinical education, it's generally viewed very favorably, and clinical instructors, two of which we have here tonight helping us as facilitators that have taught in these models. I think they can speak to this at some point. Once CIs have taught in this model, typically they say, this is great, I want to do this again. And some even say, I won't do it any other way. They find the workload manageable. Another big key that comes out of this is that there is actually reduced burden on the CI because the students are relying more on each other. There are positive productivity numbers that come out of this, particularly in acute care. That's been looked at in a couple of studies, current studies in the literature. And CIs perceive that their students learn better in this model. But we know that they need a supportive environment in order to do this. So if we know all these benefits are there, why is this not more mainstream? So one is that we're discovering they need this supportive environment. They need to be prepared. They want teaching strategies. These are all things that have come out of a good volume of literature, both in physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy. Many of the authors suggest that CIs need training. They need academic support. They need specific information on teaching strategies. So our team that started really with Alice and Katie coming together and saying, why is this not happening more within our own PT community in Colorado? And they spoke with CIs and discovered that there was resistance. There were negative perceptions around the model. So they questioned, how can we better support CIs? And that's where the toolkit came from. And then we disseminated that toolkit to our CIs in the region. And when we looked at what the CI's perceptions were when we first shared this toolkit with them and encouraged them to try taking 2 students at one time, some interesting things came to the surface. The most interesting to me, I think, was that inexperience alone is a barrier to the model. So if we can find ways to overcome the, I haven't done this, I'm afraid of this, CIs are more willing to try it. And then once they try it, we know both from our personal experience with this study and other literature, once they've tried it, they're hooked, so to speak. Some benefits and challenges came to the surface as well that really aligned well with what was already out there in the literature. The biggest benefit that CIs identified was the huge benefits to the student in terms of how they function in a peer learning environment. The good old CPI continued to be a challenge, but we've even got strategies for that we'll discuss. And the other big key that came out of this, specifically from our CIs, was they reinforced over and over again that the NCCE and the academic program and a relationship between all of the parties was really important to make this a successful model. So we had the toolkit development. We knew that for some reason, the toolkit alone didn't quite seem sufficient to support our CI. So this slide simply outlines the big picture approach to how we came to what we think is the best way to prepare. So these next 2 slides are really sort of plunked here to get academic programs and SCCEs really thinking about, particularly in today's world, how can you adequately prepare your CIs to be successful in the model? So this was our plan. So we had the toolkit. We realized they needed something more. So we settled on and implemented a workshop where we bring CIs together. We have them go through a workbook version of the toolkit and really create strategies that are specific to their setting. The other piece that we added was very intentional preparation of both the CI and the student. And then we're seeing things really take off at the local and regional level within Colorado. Right now, the concept of doing a workshop with CIs is challenging. So I invite CI academic programs and SCCEs to think, as we're talking through all of these specific strategies in the remainder of our session, what can you do in place of a workshop right now that might help you successfully prepare your CIs to really feel ready and empowered to teach in this model? All right, I think, I'm going to back up here. So we're going to pause here. That's our overview of how the toolkit was born and the foundational information that this is a really powerful learning model for students. So we'll pause there just for a minute to see if there were any questions that came out of the chat that we want to address.
There weren't any specific questions. There was just to highlight, if people are still looking for the toolkit, I've reposted the links to where you can find that. So those who are just joining, I'll post it again just so it's there. So you can find the toolkit there. And then a lot of comments around how these concepts of teaching in the collaborative model could be incorporated into the CI credentialing course and training. So while I don't think we'll address that specifically in this presentation, I think it's great to hear that excitement and interest, because we agree that there's an opportunity there. So
great. All right. Shalene, I'm going to hand things over to you, but I just lost my PowerPoint controls. Hold on one second.
Sure.
Okay, I'm all set.
Great, so we have two images for you to consider to demonstrate the basic roles of the players in clinical education. For those of you who have taken the APTA CI credentialing course, this diagram should look familiar to you. So here in this first model is a visual of the traditional one student to one CI model. Notice the patient is in the center with the academic institution, the CI, the SCCE, and the student all supporting the focus onto this patient. However, if we look at the second model, this visual represents more of a culture of education. This is one where the SCCE, the CI, the academic, and even the patient now become educators. When we support education and the focus is there, can you think of anyone else that maybe could be missing from this model that can help us in our quest to educate the student?
You can throw those in the chat.
You're right on, Kim. That was quick. That's our peers. That's right. So the fundamentals for providing a strong clinical experience adds value to each player that remains unchanged. And in fact, we agree with the literature that CI skill development and satisfaction will occur with an increase in productivity, just as Catherine said. So we've moved on here to the toolkit. This is our first time to dive into the toolkit. If you look on page 3, here is our section about the roles and responsibilities of each member. You can see how it's broken down into the different phases of the pre-experience, then during the experience, what each roles need to be doing, and then at the end of the experience, how they wrap that up. So just like you would prepare for your patients, you need to prepare for education. You know this, right? But how does that look different in the 2-to-1 model? We need to make sure that each member needs to know what to do prior to everyone coming together. The CIs have responsibilities and the students do as well. What we've noticed from our research that Catherine mentioned is that preparedness is important, and the relationship between the academic institution and the site clinical coordinators are elevated. As you can see here, we also have added in the students' need to prepare for this model. This is different than what they may have envisioned before in that one student to one CI model. What we have incorporated is a diagram for you to look at how the academic institution can help prepare the student in this model. They can talk about the 2-to-1 design. They can talk about research in the peer-to-peer learning. Individually, they need to work on their own goals as well as work together in the team. They need to know about their team member, their style of learning, and their goals, because they will be helping in that facilitation of learning. So that discussion of the learning styles is important, including conflict management in case that comes up. The academic institution supports this preparation prior to sending the students out to the clinical affiliation. The orientation on the right now infers that the student has progressed in time to the orientation that happens on site. Here, the CI and the SCCE need to be oriented in the model, and they then have that orientation day discussion with the students, talking about how does that 2-to-1 model work in their particular setting? What are their expectations for this model in the experience? How much experience have they had before? What are they bringing to the team as an individual and as a team member? I believe we all understand the benefits of an orientation. We want to emphasize today that preparation matters. We've seen a lot of this in research from our colleagues before about how important a formal orientation is to set the stage for a positive experience. Students also place a high value in this process, feeling like they are secure and belong in the group if they are able to have that one-on-one time for orientation. It has been proven through research to show improved student outcomes when they participate in an orientation. And since this is about relationships, that orientation is helpful to start those interpersonal conversations about how to take risks, encouraging that student to talk about physical therapy and listen to what it means to them. This is a good time for open truth-telling and create an environment that encourages it. If you're able to share less than perfect performances as a CI and what you learn from them, you give the student permission to take risks, make mistakes, and to learn from them. Make sure in this time to also review the student's goals and objectives. By having an orientation, the student and the CI is more prepared. So in our toolkit, we helped you with this. Let me see what page that's on. I believe it's, is that on, I believe it's on page 4, my apologies. You have a diagram here to a student's orientation. And in here it shows what the academic institution should be doing, talking to the students privately and together as a team, encouraging them to learn about each other, as well as orienting both the SCCE and the CI about this model, making sure that they have the toolkit and they feel prepared in this model. Speaking of both the benefits and the challenges of the model potentially helps all parties to feel prepared for this rotation. Then let's move down to the CI's preparedness. So we've already had the academic institution actively prepare the student for this model. Many of us also have the students interview together, see how they complement each other. So we've done that piece from the academic institution side. Now we need to make sure that the SCCE, but even more so the CI, feels prepared for this rotation. Several CIs have commented about the need to know strategies for teaching in this model. They may have already have preconceived ideas of anticipated challenges, and it's beneficial to talk about these. Some of that we will talk about in breakouts here later today. It's important to provide intentional support. What we found in our research is that those CIs who did this well really felt supported by their SCCE, as well as the academic institution that they partnered with. They knew if they ran into a challenge, they could pick up the phone and give us a call and help problem solve with ideas on what to do if census was low, what to do if the team wasn't progressing together in the same direction. all that can be improved through enhancing the CI's preparedness for their educational learning. So how do we help prepare the CI? We want to make sure that if you're new to this model, that you learn more about it. We saw a large volume of people who were nervous, apprehensive, and didn't want to try it just because they never had before. They hadn't seen it, and so they didn't necessarily want to try it. How you can minimize that fear is to be here today, talk with a lot of our colleagues that are here today who have done this before. They're a rich resource of a mentoring type of relationship that you can foster and try the model together. Read up on the peer-to-peer literature. We have resources for you to look at the end, and that will also help calm your fears that others like yourself have tried this across the country. So expand your knowledge of the adult learning principles and peer-to-peer learning, which this model really relies on heavily, and understand the power of using those. We want to encourage you to create a structured experience. It's very challenging to go into something new without structure. So plan accordingly, get people around you to support you, learn more teaching strategies that we'll help you with here a little bit today, and then give it a try. We have this toolkit for you. I want you to look it over. This is a great way for you to learn more about the collaborative model, read more, like we were just talking about, connect with clinicians here today who have done this before. Always go to your academic partners as well. They're happy to help. All of us here are happy to help, and I imagine several others are as well. There's references at the end for your reading, and I found a lot of people find listening and reading about this model and its success helps them get over the fears that they have. So structure is important in any academic, any clinical rotation, but especially in this collaborative model. Let's see here. Why is preparation critical for everyone? The elephant in the room is challenges happen. Certainly we're in a time that is challenging and fear is normal. So it's healthy to be vulnerable, recognize there could be some potential challenges, and attempt to alleviate them prior to this rotation. Intentional support is important, and meeting with your academic partners should help assist in these structures.
All right, so I think we'll pause there and run through some of the questions that are in the chat. I think that was our right place to pause. And then we'll swap speakers again.
I want to highlight a couple things. There are some comments around, we're speaking about the 2-to-1, but this collaborative model includes also 3-to-1 model, 4-to-1 model. So, you know, defining what we mean by the collaborative model, while we're using the term 2-to-1, because that's really the most common way that we see it implemented in the clinical environment. This can also, many of these strategies and principles are applied to 3-to-1 and 4-to-1 models as well. There's also a lot of great comments and thoughts around the structure of pairing students and whether they're from the same program at the same level. And some of that we will talk about as we go through the presentation, but some of these comments and ideas and brainstorming around what do you do with students that are at different levels and what challenges, I'm just going to say really hang on to some of those thoughts, because those are really great opportunities to brainstorm and hear from others in your small group around what has worked for others or what ideas you might have related to that. And finally, there's some questions around like what happens if if there's differences in preparedness or learning styles or progression, and that certainly will be covered as we talk about some of the challenges as we go through the presentation.
Yeah, I wonder if it's Jennifer Watson, if you don't mind, she's one of our clinicians on our panel of facilitators tonight. I don't mean to put you on the spot, so you can stay silent if you want to. If you want to comment on what you put in the chat, just briefly around your experience with managing students at different levels in the clinic.
So I think you do have to know going into it, and I think both students have to know going into it. When I first had students from different levels, it was kind of that one clinical, it just happened to overlap, and it was given the option of saying, do you want to hold off on either one of these, or can you still provide this? So it was a little bit more of a learning curve. I actually have 2 students coming up that are on different levels in this next month. I think that it works well for mentorship, and I think that when it comes down to it, all the students are going to be learning different things from different schools at different times. So while one CE1 is appropriate for one thing, it's in one school, it's closer to a CE2 in different schools. And I think that they work well off of each other. I don't know if that really answered, but I think it's a very individual thing, but it's not a huge amount of change that you have to do.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to hand the reins over to Alice.
Okay, you could change the slide, please. So when we think about structure, we're going to look at it through the lens of the clinical instructor. And it's really important to remember that effective learning is planned. So structure is really the nuts and bolts behind this whole entire 2-to-1 model or collaborative model, giving you a broad overview of how you can organize and plan activities are important. So for the clinical instructor, it's really important to think about the type of setting that they're in, the type of workload distribution that they're thinking about when they take 2 students, and any other important facets of the CI's work, whether it's related to teaching students or just other obligations that they have throughout the day, as well as what kinds of meetings are you going to have. You're going to be a team, so you're going to want to have team meetings, but you're also always going to remember it's very important to individually work with each student because you will be assessing each student on an individual level. You also have to think about the CPI and any other paperwork that's related to clinical education that you need to make sure that you have time, you carve out the time to do that paperwork and you're not doing it all overnight and on the weekends. It's also kind of interesting that you got to really kind of think about these activities, that how they may be the same activities, they may look completely different during an early experience in the first couple of weeks versus a later experience in the later part of that experience, in a later experience. So let's go ahead and change the slide. So if we kind of make it a little more simplistic, we can look at the structure of the experience and, think about your calendar. What does your day look like? And just, what's included in it? And a simple way to maybe remember is the time, tasks, and team. So how much time does it normally take? Let's be honest, when you have 2 students, it's going to be a little bit more hectic and you're going to have to organize it a little bit better. And you can think about it in small chunks, meaning on a smaller scale, hour to hour, or even on a larger scale from week to week. So by examining the specific activities and tasks that you would like to have as part of this learning experience, you'll be able to closely relate how much time you need. And of course, you're going to be developing that. In terms of, and then as well as your tasks, what are your tasks? What are they going to inquire? What are they going to entail? Not just patient care. You want to think of documentation time. You also want to think about your CPI and your one-on-one time meetings, as well as your student meetings. And then your team. Your team is you and a student, and then all 3 of you together, or 4, depending on how big you want this model. So let's go ahead and switch the slide. And this is just an example of creating structure from a daily to weekly type of experience. And if we looked at maybe an earlier experience, the students, the CIs, are rarely working together in that first week. You might want to consider some morning huddles, and perhaps the CI is organizing those huddles. Caseload management. In the very early stages, this is going to be more team-based. So the clinical instructor may be treating alongside of the students. Documentation time. Students need a lot more documentation time when they first start practicing. So you want to make sure that you kind of put that in, and how you work it. If one student's treating a patient, while another student's documenting, that's perfectly fine. You want it to work for your day and the flow of your day, as well as how many people can be in that clinic. In terms of peer-to-peer learning, this really should be without the CI. And that peer-to-peer learning may be more of like a fishbowl type learning where you're giving them ideas. And we'll go into that a little bit more in teaching strategies. Time away from the students, I think this is really emphasized. This is very important, that the CI does not have to have these 2 students or more than 2 students glued to the hip. You are allowed to go to the restroom by yourself. And you are allowed to maybe walk down the hallway or even have the students, when they're doing peer-to-peer learning time, to be away from the CI. So think about that. You really need to be strategic, because you don't want to be doing the CPIs at midnight and having to do 2. That's probably something that really is nerve-wracking for clinical instructors. Team meetings, I've already kind of talked about it. You got to kind of figure out how you want to do those team meetings. You want to have CI and individual student meetings as well. So if we kind of look to the right of this slide, you'll see now we're going into maybe the end of the week or the beginning of next week, however you'd like to do it. Students are really working together. They should be more gelled together. They're starting to see some shifting of activities and responsibilities. So more on the students' part, less on the CI's part. Caseload management may be some team-based and individual-based. You might see starting that to emerge. And the CI is now walking away from actually putting their hands on patients. They are becoming the true teachers. Peer-to-peer learning, again, that doesn't change without the CI. Time away from students, again, thinking about how much time do I need to get the CPIs done and how other obligations that I have to have. One quick thing about the CPI, a great strategy is to start early or take notes in a notebook. So you don't get your students mixed up and you're not trying to get it done right before midterm and right before final. Okay, and we already know about the meeting. So let's go to the next slide, please. So now let's look at somebody that perhaps is in a later experience. We could go back, same kind of thing, just now it's a little different. The students are really doing maybe more of the planning and the coordinating. The students are maybe facilitating those morning huddles. The CI does not have a caseload. The patients may be on a limited basis only. That's really key. Caseload management, pretty much on the students. Peer-to-peer learning, again, without the CI. Time away from students, thinking of your tasks and any other non-related student activities that you need to get done. Your team meetings, and then your CI and individual meetings. As we look at that later part of the week or a later part of the experience, the students should be pretty much independently managing their caseloads. The CI is now acting more as a consultant. They've been a teacher this whole time, but now they're acting more as a consultant, and the students are providing more feedback, more and more feedback on clinical decision making. Students are probably going to be involved in in-services and projects. Again, peer-to-peer learning happens without the CI. It can happen with the CI to practice special skills. Time away, again, is still important to have in your meetings as well. So next slide. So let's talk about teaching strategies, establishing those teaching strategies, because this is an area that when we really focus on this in the workshops. But for tonight, we're just going to kind of just give you an idea. It's true, it's hectic. It's going to be a little more hectic that first week when you have students anyway, but when you have 2 students, it's going to be even a little more hectic. So give yourself a little grace. Fall into that toolkit, lean into the school, and also talk to the students. But your teaching strategies are essentially going to be the same when you're doing a one-to-one versus more than one student. You're going to want to understand those learning styles. You're going to want to start with feedback. Maybe you're giving more feedback, maybe the sandwich feedback. Yesterday, Shalene and I were interviewing students, and one said, I just want the meat. I don't want the bread. So, you're going to have to figure out what students like. How kinds of questions are you going to ask? You're going to be asking those questions of inquiry, questions that are more questioning, listing, tell me more about it. How did you arrive at this conclusion? What evidence do you have support? Everything that you already have in your toolkit, you're going to be modeling this type of feedback, because eventually the students are going to be giving that kind of feedback and that kind of questioning approach to each other. And that's where the peer-to-peer learning is so rich, and why students become much more confident and much more skillful in their clinical reasoning and even thinking on their feet. it's less of a risk for them because they have someone with them that they've been practicing with. The 1-minute CI model is something that they use, especially I'm going to promote the APTA CI credentialing, level 1 and level 2. This is really expanded in level 2 of really how to optimize in 1 minute, but it's really 5 minutes of how to look at 5 certain criteria that's very, very easy to do once you start practicing it. So again, always consider the learning environment for what's pertinent to your setting and what's teaching strategies. So the next slide just kind of breaks it up to what does it look like for an earlier experience, teaching strategies, and a later experience. And these are just ideas. But in an earlier experience, when you have students, you're planning more and coordinating more for the students. Actually, is that the correct slide? For learning, for an earlier experience for teaching strategies, you're definitely going to have maybe conduct a learning assessment in terms of knowing the learning strategies. That will happen for both the early experience and later experience. You want to know what the preferred learning styles are for the earlier students in the first part of the clinical experience. And then as you get into a later experience, you're going to be playing with that a little bit more. And you're going to be challenging the students to get out of their comfort zone into looking at other different types of learning styles. In an earlier experience, the students are going to be probably doing a little bit more observation, and you're going to be modeling what you want the students to be doing in the clinic, as opposed to when they're getting into a later experience. That's going to be more self-directed learning for the student. In terms of providing hands-on, you might be doing some more hands-on teaching strategies in the earlier experiences. And that doesn't negate in a later experience that you're not going to do that. You certainly will, because there are higher level skills that the students are going to want to learn and practice and get feedback on. But know that you may be coddling those students a little bit more as a peer. And in their peer-to-peer learning groups, at early on in an earlier experience, you might be giving like the fishbowl, where you may be actually having to tell the students, hey, think about somebody that has just had a CBA. And what I want you to do is I want you to think about what are you going to do to facilitate standing or sitting. You may have to give them ideas, but in a later experience, the students should be already thinking about those ideas and moving forward into thinking about getting into entry-level practice. So if we could change the slide. So these are just an example, because this is another question that always comes up, is how does this look when you have 2 students in the clinic and you have just one of you, and now you even have COVID, and you may have some room restrictions and restrictions of how many people can be in one space. So early on, the students may co-evaluate and design a plan of care together under the direct involvement of the CI. That would be an earlier experience. A little bit later on into the experience, and these are more of an experience for earlier student, this one student may take the lead on the evaluation while the second student observes, or they are the scribe and they're documenting, and the CI is still giving direct feedback. And then finally, students will be leading the evaluations independently and documenting independently, while the CI observes from a distance and facilitates that peer-to-peer feedback. It can work really seamlessly with the right planning and the right strategies and expectations that will be well talked about before you even get moving into the clinical experience. Always talking about the expectations. So in the toolkit, you will see that, I believe it's on page 9 and 10, you can look from this graph, this grid, that the activities, just examples of an earlier experience, the activities on the left are listed, but then there's a progression. And this is just an idea of how you get each student to progress together and then separately. And you can go through each of those components. That's why you want to break down the activities and the tasks to figure out how much it takes, what time it takes. And then in the bottom part of that grid, you'll see just an example of, this is always like, well, how many patients should a student see on their own, and how many patients should students see together? And of course, it really depends on the team and the patient caseload. But what you'll see is maybe in the earlier clinical experience, maybe the patient, they're seeing 1 to 2 patients each, but then they're also seeing 2 to 4 patients each as a team. And if you go down to like a 7 weeks, week 7 and week 8, maybe each of them are seeing 6 to 8 patients on their own, and then they're sharing as a team 1 to 2 patients that might be more complex. So as you can see, there's really a great couple strategies that you can use. And it's going to develop as you get more experience with this, but students are also trained in this progression as well. So it works beautifully. You just have to be able to be patient and communicate, have those meetings. Next slide, please.
I'm going to back up one slide just for a second, Alice, because two slides. Alice is right. Before the slides are posted, this will get fixed. This was copied from another slide. Alice really had the strategies laid out in this bullet form as a sort of a condensed version of the toolkit. So this will be corrected before you get the slides.
Oh, thank you. I just winged it. I hope that was okay.
That was perfect.
Okay. Okay. So how about we just see if there's anything in the chat that Katie that came up?
There is a lot in the chat, which
I
is
know.
great. I mean, there's a lot of comments, and I think what's wonderful is there's a lot of discussion back and forth. There was a comment and a question around the carving out of time and finding, you mentioned earlier in the section around carving out time for student management as well as paperwork. And the question was, how is that possible when CIs are already tasked with being, faced with productivity demands, even with one student, and now we're saying carve out time. So there was some nice, a few responses to that. And I just wanted to open it up if there was anyone, either our clinician facilitators that wanted to provide some insight into how they've managed that before we moved on, because I think it was an important question around the structure of this type of experience. And if not, I think it's also a really good topic to talk about in your small group.
I can say something about that. I found that it does take away your productivity in the initial few weeks of, coordinating and orienting your students, but towards the end, as they become more efficient and become more productive themselves, it actually evens out or even actually increases productivity towards the end, because then you're having 2 students and even maybe technically a larger caseload potentially. So in the way, it kind of evens out in the end. So it may feel like more work at the beginning, but as time goes on, typically it evens out, if not increases a little bit in my experience.
Thanks, Katie. I also think, just to reinforce that idea that especially at the beginning, the students don't have to be with every patient. They don't have to be with you the entire time. So even if your caseload can't drop at the beginning of the experience, they may not need to be with, both students don't need to be with you for every patient, and they can work together on some of the onboarding and orientation. They can do some of their work together. So we kind of keep that in your back pocket as a, sort of a permission to allow a ramp up time for the students in the first part of that experience as they ramp up their involvement in patient care.
Yeah, and I think the only other thing I would build on from what Alice said, she touched on the concept of how you can really be proactive about the CPI process. She mentioned that. And not only just pen and paper, but know that you can have the CPI open at any time and be adding comments in on an ongoing basis. We have a number of CIs who keep a running Word document and they copy and paste into the CPI once they're ready to finalize it. So a lot of these strategies will come out in our group discussion as well. So please keep asking specific questions. There were a number of questions in the chat too around the match process, and I'll call it more our philosophy. And we'll touch on that a little bit later, but I'll prompt you now to think a little bit about, it's not a perfect process. It's all about preparation. So, and we'll come back to that.
And the only other thing I'll say from the chat is there's a lot of there were some questions around COVID and the impact of COVID on this model, and that we'll touch on that. We'll talk about it in the small group, but also after the small group discussions as well.
Okay, are we doing okay for time?
Yeah, we're in pretty good shape.
Okay, great. So now we're going to move to the challenges and the barriers. And we want to do a little poll, and we want to know, what do you envision as the biggest challenge to your implementing this 2-to-1 model in your practice setting.
Can you give a quick direction on where the polls are? There were some people in the beginning that were having a hard time finding the poll.
They should just pop up on your screen.
Okay. Looking good here. Starting to slow down a little bit. Now this is a really nice spectrum of, everyone's got a little bit of a different barrier that they think or might be a challenge, and these are all really valid. What's great is that access to help, that's awesome. Sounds like people are feeling that their academic programs will give them good support, as well as their clinical setting and their SCCE. But time is the big winner. And that does certainly make sense. Again, that goes back to organization and planning and having confidence that you can do this. So thank you for taking that poll. Does anyone else want to comment about the poll results?
I had a thought around time and now I've lost it. I think we'll touch on it a little bit more, but the whole idea that as you go along, you're relinquishing your caseload to your students, which then frees up time for you to do other things. So you really have to embrace, as the CI, this concept of handing your caseload over to students. They're still supervised by you, but it does open the door for you to have the time to do other duties.
That's really important and very good point. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. These are some of the things we have done these workshops in Colorado, North Carolina, and in the Northwest, and they've been really very successful. And these are some of the common things that we heard, some themes, as well as what we've seen in the research. I don't even want to try this. How will this work with social distancing? My patients won't like it. My boss will never allow it. And how can I manage 2 students if they both struggle? So we're going to get into this a little bit. We'll go ahead and change the slide, please. So the perceived barriers that have been researched and documented very nicely in the literature, as well as within our little sphere of research and during the workshops, increased administrative duties are probably one of the greatest perceived barriers that may prohibit people from trying to do the 2-to-1 model. But what we find is prepare and structure, please use the toolkit, as well as going to this training as well will really help you. An increased CI workload, that's enough to make you not want to do the 2-to-1 model. But let me tell you that we also have what Catherine just said, you got to relinquish that caseload to students. And students, actually, you're going to know when you need to relinquish that caseload. You're going to empower their peer-to-peer learning this way. It doesn't go the first day that you're going to just give up your caseload. So it will be a very natural sequence. Challenging that student partnership. So here's where we do a lot of work on the academic side, is to make sure that you have that support. And at our programs, we actually interview our students, and we make sure that they are a good match and that they're also well equipped. That Shalene had talked about earlier, is that, you know, they're going to have to know how to do conflict management. They're going to have to give feedback. So really empowering them. And what we're doing is we're empowering them to be professionals. Limited knowledge in the 2-to-1 model. Well, that's why you're here. And hopefully you'll find that this has been helpful. And then decreased productivity. Our colleague Jen Watson and Katie McCord, they know this. The literature says no, not in acute care practice. And we know that there's some ongoing studies happening in outpatient orthopedic. But the most recent study, if you want to read it or show your clinical manager, was done in JOPD was published in 2019. So you can find that article there. And actually we have it in the reference page, I believe. So next slide, please. So here's some of the elephants that we end up having to deal with. We can't just say the elephant in the room. We really have to talk about this. There are some challenges that go on into a clinical setting, regardless of if you have one-to-one students, but when you have two-to-one students, you know, the low census can really feel like a panic for the clinical instructor as well as the students. And there are so many things that you can do, and we have suggestions in the toolkit of what happens when there's a low census. That is a gift of time and a gift to really promote that peer-to-peer learning, as well as imagination of what do you use in your downtime. Personality and learning style differences. Again, what we do in our program is we match our students, but we also have students from different programs that we don't even know about that come together, and then they find out the first day that they have a student. Let's try not to have that happen. Let's keep the communication, because what the programs will do is they will connect the students together prior to the start of that clinical experience. So if you know that you're going to get two students from two different schools, please, please, please connect with the universities so we know, and we'll just do a Zoom meeting. Students just love knowing who their partner is going to be, their peer partner. Think about it when they're going away to college. They want to know who their roommate is going to be. And performance and skills differences. This is where the artwork comes, the art and science of a clinical instructor. A really good one is going to be able to treat this as, well, what happens when I have two different patients with same diagnosis? How do I handle that? So you're going to break down those skills and you're going to work through it, as well as the students are going to identify where they can help their peer partner improve. And then the challenges with COVID-19. We're going to get into that because it's going to be all unique for each person in the room. So what we want to do now is let's go into our breakout sessions.
And hopefully you found that helpful. I think I'll just highlight a little bit of what we talked about in our session, which I think hopefully you all got some chances to talk about structure and sort of what that looks like for on a kind of a day-to-day basis. We ended up talking a lot about what does it mean for a student to be, how do you demonstrate entry level or some of the expectations if two students are sharing a caseload? And so, you know, if the structure and the strategy is to break your caseload in half and have each student kind of managing portions of that caseload throughout the experience, what does that look like at the end? So I would just encourage, I think what that emphasizes is that clarification of expectations. Doesn't matter how many patients a student sees to demonstrate entry level or whatever, you know, on whatever tool you're using, or is it around what are they demonstrating in their patient care? And ultimately, I think what I'm hoping people take away from this module, this webinar, is teaching in a 2-to-1 incorporates a lot of the same strategies that you would use when you're teaching in a 1-to-1 model. But there is a little bit of a shift in mindset around what does it mean to share a caseload with a student? How does a student demonstrate entry level expectations during a clinical experience? So it's important, I think, to shift your mindset around that and to think about, with your academic partner, what are the expectations, and clarifying that when you have two students. We also talked a bit about telehealth, and that leads into this slide here. And really what we wanted to highlight in this slide, and when we talk about COVID, because that's on everyone's mind right now, and then we throw in this idea of the 2-to-1, and you think, well, how am I going to do the 2-to-1 when I have physical distancing in my clinical environment? My clinicians are doing telehealth for the first time and learning that on the fly. And now I'm teaching, but now I'm going to teach two students. So I think what we want to highlight here is we recognize that those are all challenges that you're facing, either with 1-to-1 model or a 2-to-1 model. When you have aspects around physical distancing and those kinds of barriers, again, problem solving with your academic partner and your key academic partner and who you're working with is really helpful, again, to clarify expectations around Is it okay if a student is not always with the CI? Is it okay that a student is not seeing every patient on my caseload? What does that look like if one student needs to be out of the room while the other student is seeing a patient? Thinking about telehealth, I feel like we're building the ship while we're, building the car while we're driving it right now. Many clinicians are learning telehealth and implementing that in their practice for the first time. And we really don't have a lot of guidance in our education world around what does that look like to teach students in telehealth? How do they demonstrate outcomes and competencies in the areas that we typically assess students in a telehealth model? I think with the 2-to-1, what you might find is a great opportunity if you're going to have 2 students incorporated into a telehealth session, perhaps they can demonstrate some of their skills around their manual skills and their hands-on skills with each other. And that is allowed. That can be a part of how a student demonstrates competency during a clinical experience. And then don't forget that alternative learning experiences are important for 1-to-1 model and 2-to-1 model. And in the COVID era, it's as your caseload might be lower because your caseload, your practice is lower right now. You may not have as many patients on the acute care side for your student to see because you're on a COVID floor or your part of your day is seeing COVID positive patients. Thinking and planning for those alternative learning experiences are really helpful here. Planning ahead. Are there other clinicians that the student can spend some time with? Are there other learning opportunities in the setting that they can spend time doing besides direct patient care? Are there journal articles and case-based scenarios that you can have the student work on instead of direct patient care? So being creative with what those alternative learning experiences are, I think would be really helpful, particularly in the COVID era. I'm going to pause here and just see if any other facilitators wanted to comment on any conversation that occurred in their small groups, especially related to COVID.
Katie, I'll chime in. This is Jenny. And one of the things that came up in ours, I think that for people that are just trying to start with this model, this isn't directly related to COVID, but I just wanted to reiterate your point of really reaching out to the academic programs to help you both with COVID problem solving, as well as if you want to start the 2-to-1 model. It's critical that you don't just try to, I admire and applaud those who want to just jump in and try on their own, but to enhance the success, really, I think that collaboration between the academic partner and the clinical partners really will help. That collaboration is really going to enhance the success.
Jenny, thanks for saying that. We had a similar conversation and comment around how do I even get a buy-in? I was asked, do we have like a motivational brochure or video we can show to the CIs? And what I recommended to this clinician was start with a key partner. So who is your one key academic partner that you could say, we're not going to do 2-to-1 from everyone, but maybe I'm going to partner with this institution and say, let's work together. Help me figure out what's going on here. Help me understand how we can work together to make this happen. So there can be really that intentional support. And that's really important here in COVID times too, of again, clarifying expectations, problem solving through space issues and physical distancing issues and caseload issues as well.
Yeah, I think I would just simply add to that too, Katie. We don't have the raw video of how do we get everybody over that hump of trying this the first time, but we've sort of started to take the approach of just talk to me about it. There is zero expectation for you to do this. Let's just have a conversation. And once we start going through the toolkit or talking about it, people get excited. And as soon as that happens, then they're willing, like you said, to partner once and try this with no expectation that you ever have to do this again. And then we know once you've done it, you're probably going to like it. So
So let's,
Katie, I was
go
going to
ahead.
say, in terms of doing the 2-to-1, we've had an experience with 2 different academic programs, each of us taking, one of our students and partnering with one of our clinic sites. So that clinic site reached out to 2 of their closed programs, and we started to work together. And it was really fun. We did an orientation each time before we would send the students out. And it almost made the ClinEd team bigger, and it made the resources even greater, because now we had a DCE and a student from one program, a DCE and a student from another program, the SCC and the CI, and we all met ahead of time, and we did orientation. And then again, it was just a lot of fun. The students were real excited to have that kind of greater breadth of a team behind them. And it has been very, very successful. So it can work out both with, one program or from students from different programs.
Thank you. Catherine, let's go to the next slide, because I think it leads in nicely to the academic role. So just like what we were talking about. And really this is just to highlight again that I think up until this point, we've talked a lot in this webinar around the CI responsibilities or the site responsibilities and what they can do on the site side. But it's very important to understand that the academic side also has responsibilities to make this a successful experience for all that's involved. So the DCEs on the line, you're not off the hook. That there's responsibilities that we all have to support our CIs and to support our students through training, through communication, and through intentional preparation. So, really, there was a lot of comments in the chat around how do we match students? How do we get students to the clinical site? What does that look like on the academic side? It is important for the students to know that they're going into a 2-to-1 model. So it's important that academic programs are clear with their students as to depending on how you match and what your lottery or match system or whatever you're using helps to facilitate student understanding of the experience that they might be selecting or that you're matching them to. And that does require that the academic or clinical site notify academic programs that it is a 2-to-1 model. I've definitely had experiences where it's a surprise 2-to-1. So there is need for communication on both sides for clinical sites to notify the academic program. The academic program can really help them prepare students to identify the learning opportunities and the positive nature of peer learning. What does that look like in the clinical environment? You may be doing team-based learning in your academic program or opportunities for small groups and peer learning in the didactic side, but what does that look like in the clinical environment? And it is important to emphasize that with your students. Ensure that they understand that they may not see every patient every day. Ensure that they understand that there's value in how that they communicate with each other. And also preparing them to advocate for their need and their individual feedback, seeking out feedback when they are in a 2-to-1 model. Thoughtfully matching those students is important. So, and every program may have a different philosophy around this. Whether you want to feel like you need to match the students that have the same learning style, or is it matching students that are just interested and open? So what are the qualities and characteristics that you're identifying in your students that you think make them a good match together, but also a good match for the clinical experience? Providing the academic role in providing CI training or resources, and whether that be formal training and using this toolkit as a way to open those doors of communication and support for the CI, or other resources you may have at your academic institution, and offering that support. And that's not to say that the academics DCE or ClinEd team is going to come into the clinical environment and take over and we know everything, but what can we offer to help support a CI? What are their needs? What's the root cause analysis that can happen to help understand what the CIs need and the clinical site need to make this a success? And that really goes back to that partnership we were talking about earlier. And then that regular and timely communication that starts before the clinical experience occurs throughout the clinical experience, checking in with the CI, with the SCCE, and with the student. And then post-experience, how did that go? What feedback do you have? How can we help work together to make that a better experience again? So all of those are important in supporting the CI and really supporting this experience overall, because it supports not only the CI, but it supports the student. It supports the clinical site and the clinical environment in making this a positive experience. You can go to the next slide, Catherine. So this is really a reiteration of what we've been saying, but just in summary, what we hope that you take away from this webinar is that the 2-to-1 model is a really amazing opportunity to put academic clinical partnership into action. So it's an opportunity for the academic side and the CIs and the SCCEs to work together to figure out how to make this a successful learning environment and a successful teaching experience for the CI. And that comes from all of these different areas, from student preparation, CI preparation, engaging the SCCE in their role to support the CI, the academic program being involved and engaged before, during, and after the experience, and using the toolkit, which we advocate for, but other resources and support, and offering the opportunity to really sit down and have a conversation around what is it that is going on? How can we make this happen and make this successful? What do you need? What are the needs on all ends? So I think that's it. Is that the last slide? Okay, there's a poll. I forgot. So this is the same poll that we had earlier. And so we're curious if anything has changed around what comes to mind when you hear collaborative clinical education. And it might change, it might not. I'm really excited. I'm really excited to see that bring it on. It's definitely changed.
I'm going to relaunch it. Hold on.
Oh.
Go again, everybody. It shut down after a brief response. So there we go. That's better. Hopefully it doesn't change the results.
That's great. So that's wonderful. That adequate planning and support, that's a big takeaway here, that it's, as Jenny said, one of our our facilitators said, it's not just about jumping in. We applaud that, but it's also time to plan and be thoughtful in how you approach this on all sides, academic and clinical.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for your great participation through the chat and the breakout rooms. Our plan with the great volume of really good questions from the chat is to put together sort of a frequently asked questions piece that can somewhere go along with the other information that people have helped us share and distribute with you, perhaps even on the Learning Center. So you will receive an email from somebody within the APTA, and it will have a link to the Learning Center where you can obtain your CEU credits and have access to the slides, the toolkit, and if we do it quickly enough, the frequently asked questions as well. So thank you so much for your participation. Feel free to reach out to any of us as authors or facilitators from tonight if you've got other questions and need a little nudge to help get started with this. And I don't know if any of the other facilitators have anything to add, and other than that, enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.